We're delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. It's our pleasure to present now South Asian science fiction. Tarun K Saint, Vandana Singh, and Manjula Padmanabhan in conversation with Arunava Sinha. The Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Volume 2, unfolds the new truths and realities, fears, fantasies, and infinite possibilities of the hyper-accelerating change around us. Curated and edited by writer and scholar Tarun K Saint, it has a preface and afterword by the iconic writer, playwright, and graphic artist Manjula Padmanabhan. Science fiction writer Vandana Singh's recent work is Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories. In conversation today with the versatile scholar, writer, and translator Arunava Sinha, who has 2 translations in the anthology, they speak of the interfaces of science and speculative fiction, myth, legend, fantasy, and the future. Tarun K Saint is an independent scholar and writer who's the author of Witnessing Partition, Memory, History, Fiction. He edited Bruised Memories, Communal Violence, and the writer and the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction, Volume 1 and 2. He co-edited Translating Partition, Looking Back, India's Partition, 70 Years On, and the bilingual science fiction anthology, Avatar, Indian Science Fiction. Vandana Singh Lal is a forester and a writer. While living, observing, and trying to align the world inside her head with the real world around her, Vandana, in the words of DeLillo, grew into novelhood. Her debut novel, So All Is Peace, was published by Penguin Random House in December 2019. Manjula Padmanabhan is a playwright, novelist, artist, and cartoonist. She's best known for her plays Light Out and Harvest, which won the first ever Onassis Award for Theatre in 1997 in Greece. Padmanabhan has published several books of prose, including Hot Death, Cold Soup, Kleptomania, Escape, The Island of Lost Girls, and Getting There. In 2020, she published 2 volumes of her collected plays, Blood and Laughter and Blood. Arunava Sinha translates classic, modern, and contemporary Bengali fiction, non-fiction, and poetry into English, and fiction from English into Bengali. Over 65 of his translations have been published so far, including Akhtar Usman Ilyas's Khwabnama into English and Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island into Bengali. He teaches at Ashoka University and is the book's editor at Scroll In. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on all the upcoming sessions. Please do tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Lit Fest. Ladies and gentlemen, South Asian science fiction, Tarun K Saint, Vandana Singh, and Manjula Padmanabhan in conversation with Arunava Sinha.
Hello and welcome to this session of Jaipur Lit Fest. We are here with 2 very eminent science fiction writers and 1 very eminent science fiction anthologist. It's my pleasure to welcome Manjula Padmanabhan, Vandana Singh, and Tarun Saint.
Thank you, Arunava.
It's a rare occasion for all of us. It's not often that science fiction gets the attention from a literature festival, but it's a good opportunity for us to see where science fiction fits into the larger scheme of things, because perhaps far too often it is considered something that the weirdos write and that the weirdos read, and serious people don't really take a close look at science fiction. Today, maybe we will be able to put some of those notions to rest once and for all. So I'm going to start by asking each of you in turn, starting with Manjula, then Vandana, and then Tarun, very briefly, to lay out the land for what science fiction means today for us in the year 2022, when the world itself feels like a work of science fiction. And also in the specific context of South Asia, because one of the reasons we are here is to celebrate 2 volumes of the Gollancz Book of South Asian Science Fiction. So without any further ado, starting with you, Manjula.
Thank you, Arunava, and thank you also to JLF for inviting us. I would say in today's world, science fiction is much less fictional these days. it is very close, very much closer to what we are all experiencing. So what used to be thought of as science fiction used to include such subjects as robots and time travel and space travel. Today we have robots and space travel. So all that remains is time travel. And what many of us as science fiction writers do is we do time travel. We travel to the future. So I would say a lot of what science fiction writers today, and specifically in our region, are attempting to do is to take the reader forward, sometimes backward as well. I'll stop here.
Okay, so you see time as the primary dimension along which science fiction travels, as it were.
Just one of the leading dimensions.
Leading dimensions. All right, Vandana, are you going to add to that or disagree or destroy it or strengthen it?
I agree with Manjula, but I also have something to add, which is that for me, science fiction has always been about two major things. One is revolutionary potential, that in simply by asking what if things were different than they are now, and not just asking about technology or our understanding of the universe, but also about the sociological scenario. What if things were different? That itself is a deeply revolutionary question. So that's one aspect that interests me. And often, as Manjula says, time is one of the things we play with. But it's also a metaphor. That's one of the unique things about science fiction, that literalism and metaphor are kind of commingled in very interesting ways. But the other thing that I think is really important about science fiction is that, and it relates to the first thing, is that it's a sort of way to take back both the past and the future from a colonialist experience in a way. So I think that its revolutionary potential is very important. And I'm going to mention one other quick thing, which is that mainstream literature, which comes to us from the West, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of mainstream literature I really enjoy, but there's a peculiar blindness in it, an abnormality that is so taken for granted, nobody questions it, that it's often it's all about the exclusively human. Whereas we live in a universe that is filled with other species, as well as rocks, planets, weather systems, and so on and so forth. And to pretend that none of that is important or doesn't even exist is just ridiculous and dangerous in the times in which we live. So I think science fiction, because it talks about the physical universe, because it talks about other species and our relationship to them, is ever more important. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to all of you about the colonial imprint, but first, Tarun.
Yes. So as I see it, science fiction is, of course, a genre, a type of literature, if you will, where speculative thinking has played a very important role right from its inception. Yes, it's marked by two elements, as Darko Suvin has brilliantly pointed out: elements of cognition, that is science, has to do with knowledge, consolidated forms of knowledge, and estrangement. It defamiliarizes the world as we otherwise sort of perceive it. So science fiction has enabled us to, therefore, in effect, it has enabled us to look afresh at the present, often through a kind of deflection, through, as Manjula pointed out, time, a kind of temporal disjunction into the future, but it could also be spatial disjunction, which the author might portray. Always such a pleasure to hear practitioners speak of these matters, which theorists and critics have their own way of presenting. In the South Asian context, of course, it has taken on a certain kind of unique flavor. I think what's crucial about South Asian science fiction is that, number one, it's characterized by a certain kind of, as one correctly identified, decolonizing impulse, right? From its inception in 1835 with the futuristic tale by Kailash Chandra Dutt, a journey, a narrative about the year 1845, a journal, I should say, about the year 1945. There has been that futuristic impulse, a certain kind of orientation towards alternative futures. So yes, the decolonizing impulse has been there right from the outset, a questioning of hierarchies, a certain kind of sensitivity to questions of power, for sure. But also, especially in more recent times, there's an increasing sense of, yes, the recognition of the diversity of South Asian culture. And this crosses national boundaries. So science fiction from the region has not been so much concerned with, therefore, establishing, if you will, a nationalist alternative to the colonial inheritance, but rather perhaps more transnational, cross-cultural imperatives come to the fore. So the ethical engagements reach back in time to civilizational possibilities of yore, but also look forward to futures where there could be interesting forms of conversations across national boundaries. So in other words, it's quite a polymorphous kind of form, which is polyvalent, transnational, and constantly being imbued with new elements, especially in the face of challenges such as the new social media forms of authoritarianism which we're facing, and the need for resistance. Yeah, so that's all.
Thank you. So following up from this, the idea of science fiction and even the label itself comes from the West, as is true of many of the literary labels that we employ today, thanks to the hegemony of publishing from the West. So what is specifically or uniquely South Asian about the fiction, science fiction that is written here? And maybe Manjula and Vandana, you could also refer to your own work when you're answering this question, the works of others as well as your own. What is so specifically South Asian or Indian about it? And this question also flows from the fact that there is a general notion, perhaps, that India is in a sense the home of science fiction because we've had flying chariots and many such supposedly futuristic scientific elements in the epics, which were written thousands of years ago. So, yeah, broad question, but...
Yes, it's a very broad question. I personally make a very clear distinction between mythology and science. I believe that what has often been nowadays is referred to as the science of the past was not what we would today call science. It is wonderfully creative, but it was also part of a mythological and fantastical past. I think what we can say is that the entire South Asian region has very rich mythologies, which suggests a tremendous and wonderful imagination. But what we have today is a combination of that imagination with the technological wizardry that we are surrounded by, and which in fact makes this Zoom conference possible. And while obviously we have moved on from, many of us have moved on from the colonies that defined in some ways our cultures, our countries, not our cultures. For myself, my interest is often to do with boundaries, crossing different kinds of boundaries. And in my case, I would say gender is one of my areas of interest. I don't call myself a feminist. I'm obviously not opposed to feminism. I, however, feel that we have to go beyond narrow definitions of gender. And in fact, we are seeing that in the world. There are definitions opening up. They're also closing down. And I would say that I'm straying from your question, which is about South Asian. And I would say for myself, I am South Asian. So what I write is South Asian. And that's enough for me.
Okay. That's interesting. And I would like to know more, maybe right now, about where you think the intersection between gender and science fiction is. And give us some maybe examples from your own writing.
Yeah, it's all over the place. And I'm sorry, and I hope it's okay. I'm going to hold up both my books. Yes. This is Escape. I think there's a mirror issue here. So this one is called Escape. And this one is called The Island of Lost Girls. This is first, this is second. And both books, and I hope there will be a third one, deal with the struggles of a young girl. She starts off as a young girl who grows up in a country, I don't name the country or the region, but clearly it is South Asia in some form, where all the women have been destroyed and she has been kept hidden. But as we enter the story, she has to be removed from that place and taken to wherever she might find safety, which is the subject of both books. But they're, in many ways, they are adventure books, and they are as much about the characters as about the issues of gender. But and there are no simple answers or solutions. And I would say, as I said to begin with, that it becomes South Asian because of me and my state of mind and what I offer to it.
Okay, but why is it science fiction? Why, for example, can I not say this is an extrapolation of reality with your imagination throwing in what Vandana described as what ifs? And what ifs don't necessarily have to be in the context of science or technology.
Right, because there's a lot of technology that isn't available to us now. And it does take place some unspecified few years into the future. I don't specify so that I won't be caught out by the future not being, turning up at the date in my books. But yes, there's a certain amount of technology, a great deal of technology that isn't possible. For instance, just one instance is that surgical procedures in my books make it possible to get nerve transplants so that you can have full body, not the brain, but the full body nervous systems that perhaps don't match your birth body. So you can get a great deal more surgical intervention than you can today.
All right, thank you. I will come back about this, but meanwhile, Vandana.
Well, I think that we certainly, South Asians are, humans are storytellers, firstly. And in South Asia, somehow our history, our literature has really, really been imagination expanding, as Manjula said. And I'm also not one of those people who believes in literalizing stories. In fact, I prefer the term cultural stories to mythology, because mythology is itself a problematic term, that comes from Western hegemony. But our cultural stories are, they're not meant to be alternative scientific explanations. They are about relationships of people with each other and relationships of people with the rest of the universe. And they may use, they may literalize certain aspects of nature, for example, and so on. But to think of them as science is to, like Manjula said, to take away the creative agency of the ancients who came up with those stories. And so I think that because, I was raised on such stories, and also because everywhere in India, like, we take it for granted when we are there, and then you notice the absence when you're away, like how sterile the West is in terms of stories. Like everywhere in India, you step out, you go to, the vegetable seller, and you have a conversation, and there's a story there, like you pluck stories from the air. So I think that's something that I feel like I owe a debt to being Indian and being from India and being raised in India and all of that. And so in terms of, what makes my work South Asian, well, a large part is that I am South Asian. And the other thing is also that I'm deeply interested in the idea of India and the experiment of India, which is now going in a very dangerous direction. But that original conception of a place where you have multiple peoples like attempting to coexist, amicably through and despite differences. I'm still idealistically in love with that concept. And I'm also interested in alternative paradigms, which is where I think, so we can argue about definitions. I don't think it's really worth spending too much time there. But, if you look at speculative fiction as a broad umbrella and science fiction as a kind of subset of speculative fiction, where, one definition that I've heard is that science fiction is a fiction where if you take away the scientific/technological aspect, then the story doesn't stand on its own. So in other words, that aspect is central. But the broader umbrella of speculative fiction allows you to do other things as well. And in fact, any good science fiction will include, if you're talking about an alternative society, you're also going to include, sociological difference. So, and for me, the technology is actually less important. I'm a theoretical physicist by training. I'm much more interested in aspects of how the universe is put together and how it functions, and the things that we don't understand about it. So, I think that the creative ferment that our history and culture has given us certainly informs my writing. Also, my identity as a physicist informs my writing. I'm permanently astounded by the universe and how amazing it is, from the shape of the smallest snowflake or the raindrop that slides down the window glass to, the fact that our galaxy is on slow collision course with Andromeda. So, and what makes it South Asian, like I said, is me and where I've grown up and the air I've breathed, for so many years of my formative years. But also in terms of paradigms, and I won't prolong this, but I just want to mention that if you think of a paradigm as a framework, a conceptual framework through which we construct our reality, which consists of a lot of default assumptions, unquestioned assumptions, then right now what dominates the world is a kind of Western, and this is an oversimplification, I admit that, but a Western Newtonian mechanistic paradigm. Yet I think that because I also study climate change and because that's leading us over the cliff down to disaster, that the time has come for us to question that in many ways, not in a reactionary way, which is very dangerous, but in an intelligent and curious and reflective way. Like, what are the other ways of constructing realities that aren't so destructive, that aren't unjust, that don't promote inequality? And so those are the questions that I find interesting. And I feel like in South Asia, we have many, many aspects that may provide some answers.
That's really interesting. So, because I was thinking in my head that so far I'm hearing about a sensibility perhaps that arises out of being a South Asian, as both of you have said, perhaps the settings of your stories. But I wanted to ask about, but what's in the stories that is so uniquely South Indian? And you probably just answered that. So thank you very much. But I do want to, you've given me two cues, both of which I want to come back to. Climate change, of course, because it's such a real thing now, real and clear danger. And also, I'll do this segue quickly before I come to you, Tarun, which is that it's also quite fascinating how scientists write science fiction, isn't it? I mean, I remember Fred Hoyle, for example. And then here in India or South Asia, you've had Nallikar, and then you, Vandana. So why do scientists write science fiction? What do you think?
Should I address the earlier question first?
Yes, sure, in any order. There are no rules. Anybody can answer any question in any order.
Vandana, would you like to take that? Yeah.
Well, could I make a
Manjula,
statement here, because as a non-scientist, but as an artist, I would say that scientists are extraordinarily creative people. They deal, someone like Vandana is dealing literally with the stuff of reality. So she knows how to play with it. She actually plays with the hardware. So yes, I think it is not surprising that scientists are also tremendously good at working with words and fiction, because that's part of their work. That's part of what they do. I mean, if I could be allowed to say this, Vandana has an unusual asset. She is also an excellent writer. She writes very well and would be a good writer regardless of being a scientist. So she has an asset that perhaps not all scientists have.
Well, that's very kind, Manjula. Thank you.
I'm not kind.
No, I know what you mean. Well, I appreciate your saying it nevertheless. But I think that part of the motivation is that, the sense of wonder that one gets when thinking about, the universe and how it functions and how it seems to.
You think about the universe all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it confounds us, and that's so it's as though Mother Nature is like, as Einstein said, not malicious but subtle, and you want to like figure out what it's all about, right? So part of science fiction also is to invigorate that sense of wonder that we all have, when we look around the universe. And some of these cultural stories / myths are actually about a sense of wonder. They're a response, they're an articulation of the sense of wonder. So that's part of it. But the other thing is that, Mother Nature, has certain ways of having the universe work. And sometimes as scientists, we feel like we want to say to, it's a kind of conversation with Mother Nature that, what if this wasn't the case? What would happen then? Or let's play around. And since you can't, push Mother Nature around, you have to write fiction about it, right?
If your answer could also take on the two things that Manjula
with nature
and Vandana said. Sorry, Vandana, we lost you there for a moment, so we moved on to Tarun now. Tarun.
Okay, we could come back to Vandana's final sort of point a little later, I guess. So I was just going to say that in terms of the question of South Asianness, which was the earlier question which you raised. So again, I don't think there's an essential South Asianness because it's too variegated, as I said, diverse, and in a good way. Of course, there are differences, and science fiction has right from the outset been a literature which has understood that we need to reflect deeply on difference. The problem of the other, the problem of otherness has been a key question, dealt with, unfortunately, during the pulp era, often where the other would be demonized. And I think South Asian science fiction has, in a way, developed a certain kind of skeptical view of that older conception of difference, as articulated in some of the even racist versions of science fiction which were prevalent during the colonial era. And this sort of ties in a way with the second question which you raised about scientists writing science fiction. Because let's take a sort of step back to Jagdish Chandra Bose, and he was a trained scientist who was doing a kind of, of course, as a trained botanist, he was working with plants, speaking about of course, nature in a very sort of different way from the prevalent, if you to invoke Vandana's term, paradigm of knowledge. And he was often denigrated for that. People would refuse to believe that an Indian person from the colonies could be a true scientist or really come up with scientific knowledge worthy of the name. So it's interesting, as Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay has pointed out, that in the second draft of his very well-known story, Runaway Cyclone, Mirudeshir Kahani, as I'm sure you read in the original, he brings in a character, a hermit, who actually devises kind of, a variant of hair oil, which then the scientist who is the protagonist uses to calm the cyclone when he is on the boat and at risk of his life. And ultimately the waves are calmed by that hair oil. So the question might be to ask whether he's actually postulating that the science, and certainly knowledge systems, if not science, has many diverse roots. So that's an interesting question, whether there can be a kind of radical universalism seen here. So he's not sort of advocating a kind of, again, form of indigenism, which is knee-jerk or sort of narrow-minded, but a form of perhaps radical universalism, suggesting that we need to actually broaden the horizons beyond the Enlightenment paradigm, beyond the paradigm as outlined by Vandana of Newtonian mechanics, and actually rethink the very basis for knowledge, for epistemology, for for the basis for knowledge itself. So that's an interesting observation which Vandana brought up, which prompted this train of thought. Fred Hoyle, of course, was the guru of Jayant Narlikar at MIT. After Jayant Narlikar had the chance to talk to E.M. Forster during his Cambridge days, where they were neighbors in the flat where he was resident while he was studying there. Narlikar moved on to MIT, where he was actually taught by Fred Hoyle, and I think was inspired to become a science fiction writer, perhaps after his experience of discussing E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, and after, of course, chatting with Fred Hoyle about the Black Cloud. So there are, yes, good examples of scientists who have become excellent writers. Narlikar is a giant with respect to Marathi science fiction, and Vandana, of course, is our is now perhaps leading the way. But it's not always the case. In fact, one major lamentation one has is that there are not enough scientists who try their hand, perhaps, in science fiction. So that's been a kind of gap, as it were. There could have been many more, as I think perhaps we see in the case of Western science fiction, or for that matter, Chinese science fiction. With Cixin Liu and three-body problem.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about Chinese science fiction as well. But before that, Tarun, from your survey of the science fictions of South Asia, which you used to make your choices for your 2 volumes, what are the elements that you see that are very distinctly different from the versions written in the West?
Yeah, so one I've just mentioned, right, that at least at a certain point, Western science fiction was dominated by a certain kind of tendency to present the other in a somewhat demonic light, which was sought to be reversed internally by figures like H.G. Wells, say, in The War of the Worlds, which is actually a parable about colonialism and, of course, the threat of a Martian invasion, which reverses the whole idea of colonialist outlook. So yes, that decolonizing impulse and the experience of trauma. Maybe we could speak of the colonial experience and its extended kind of manifestation, including events like the Bengal famine, including the history of divide and rule, which ultimately culminated in the terrible disaster of partition. So there is a history of trauma there. And perhaps those traumatic memories are embedded in the consciousness across South Asia. In the case of Sri Lanka, it took a more recent form with the civil war. And what's interesting to note in some of the work which we've tried to bring together in this anthology is these sort of very oblique references to traumatic histories, whether it's Shiv Ramdas's story, and his lordship is now laughing, which is a horror tale, which takes on that history of the Bengal famine and the terrible effects it had on the populace. Whether it's the story by Chandrasekhar, which parabolically refers again to an unending war in which you have a maker of memorials who is actually an augmented human who's given the task of making memorials as people are killed on the battlefield, and the ultimate irony of such a situation where that becomes the ultimate goal of a person who's devoted to memorializing violence in a certain kind of light. He completely undercuts the heroic image of warfare, or the association of masculinity and warfare. And finally, if I may quickly refer to Beena Shah's story, which is a tribute to Manto, Luni Ka Tabadla, where she projects into the future the current media wars and shows how in a future setting, the 2 states might actually decide to exchange the head honchos of media corporations to ensure that there's a sort of sense that it's they who are really hyping the conflict, the memories of the past, which may even be Ersatz memories, not real memories. So many years in the future, we haven't yet found some resolution for past traumatic memory and its sort of residue. So I think that's another commonality which one can find. Besides that, yeah, culinary diversity, as we find in Saad Hussein's work, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, a certain recognition of what Vandana was alluding to, the importance of an accommodation of difference. which was, of course, part of the idea of being Indian. But I think it was also a shared kind of conception across the board, right from ancient times to more recent moments in our history. So this is what I would like
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to ask you to think that the specific crises that are confronting South Asia or this part of the world may have played or may play a greater role in the science fiction that emerges from the region, especially as we're talking about the future, as you said, and also specifically where climate change stands in the scheme of things as far as writing of science fiction is concerned. So maybe I could go around the room asking each of you about this, starting with Manjula.
So in my work so far, I have assumed a background of many types of collapse, and because the characters in the stories are dealing with them without they're not reporting on them, because they come into their situation already struggling with the crises. So one of the things that has happened, which we realize in The Island of Lost Girls, we only realize it when we get to that novel, that the world has been split, not in a physical sense, but socially and culturally. There is no travel between the different continents of the world. And one of the reasons is because the oil fields have been blown up. They've been destroyed by atom bombs. So of course, a cataclysmic and climate destructive event has occurred. And it's in the past. It's not the subject of the book. The subject of the book is how to survive this, the apocalyptic world of the novels. And I admit to not having a tremendously optimistic view. I believe we will, the we, what constitutes a we, it seems to me, will eventually turn into people of similar and hopeful and optimistic states of mind. But what lies ahead is, I think it's very hard to hold out hope. The hope is that there are general values that some cultures have worked towards, which we can hope will make it through the cataclysms that are ahead. I don't think there's any question that there are cataclysms already starting, already ahead. How we deal with them is what will make or break our world.
Thank you. Now I feel really bleak.
Yep.
Vandana?
Well, it's certainly we are in for tough times. We are already in tough times. And also, let me also say this, that there are groups of peoples who have been living through the apocalypse for a very long time. And that includes many, many indigenous communities around the world. And you may have heard of the protest recently in West Bengal against the coal mine, which is being led by Adivasis, and what's happening in the tribal belt in India, with regard to mining and so-called development projects, which is really, really hurting the Adivasi peoples. It's something that we see in other parts of the world as well. And, North America, particularly, one should say, has a history of genocide and against the indigenous people. So the apocalypse has been happening for some groups of people for a very long time. And now it's hitting us, the relatively urbanized, privileged middle classes upward. And if you think about climate change in particular, there are different ways, there's different angles to it, of course. But one way of looking at it is that it really is a symptom of an extreme inequality, a power hierarchy, a pyramidal power hierarchy, where a few powerful people at the apex essentially create the infrastructure of the world for their benefit, so that wealth and power and resources flow upwards towards them. And we are all tied and trapped in this infrastructure, in this paradigm. We are trapped in it, and to be free of that, in a way, the reason why I write science fiction and why I write the stories I write is in part to free myself of that imaginative trap, at least for the duration of the story, to imagine something that is different. And I agree with Manjula that, it's going to get really bad. It's already bad for many of us around the world. For people like you and me, it's going to get worse, and we are going to go through hell, worse hells than we've seen before. So there's no room for any kind of Pollyannish optimism. On the other hand, there is not just room, but there is a need for what Gramsci called the optimism of the will, where we sort of walk, or we try to walk to the extent possible with people who are the most disadvantaged through this kind of valley of death and despair and suffering, to see where the light is and where the pathways are. And so what I try to do in my fiction, to the limited extent that I can, is really to see what are the little candles in the darkness, what are these, and how do they illuminate a completely different way of living and being that we can't imagine. And here I'm remembering Ursula Le Guin's famous National Book Award speech, where she said, that, and I'm quoting from memory, that we live in capitalism, its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine rights of kings. So, the kinds of ideas and infrastructures that enmesh us and trap us now are not, in fact, any more real or any more permanent than anything else, and as Ursula Le Guin said as a follow-up to that sentence, that anything that is built and conceived by human beings can be changed by human beings. So I try, the way I struggle and attempt in my fiction to walk through, to not push away the dystopia, to walk through the grief, the pain, the hardship, but also look for the candles in the dark.
Thank you.
Said.
Tarun, if you can quickly come in with the last word. Unbelievably, we are done with our time, and the best science fiction writers in the world present in this room cannot, unfortunately, change that. So,
right. Sure, yes. I was reminded of Vandana's amazing story, Reunion, which does touch upon some themes which she just outlined. And I completely agree with this point that we really need to envision alternatives, a post-capitalist alternative, perhaps even a post-human alternative. And it's being done. I mean, I'm reminded of Amitabh Ghosh's Gun Island, where he's conceiving of new forms of solidarity, new forms of resistance, in imaginative terms, which can be perhaps thought of as speculative. And perhaps this volume, I'm thinking of this, if I could pose a question to you as a translator. What was it like translating Soham Guha's story, A Song of Ice, which actually is a climate fiction story, which has a sort of a rare ability to telescope the multiple traumas of history, not forgetting events like Naxalbari or partition or even the colonial moment, while projecting into the future the possibility of a catastrophic event, which leads to a kind of, if not nuclear winter, but climatic winter-like situation, and ice age. So if you could say a few words about that, that would be brilliant as a concluding note for the session.
Well, no, thank you. I think you've said all that there is to be said about that story, and the only thing I can say to everyone is read it, please, and read every other story in both the volumes of the Gollancz books, which Tarun has
perhaps
edited.
Show now on the screen. Yeah, this
yes,
is the second volume.
Yeah, in which Vandana's and Manjula's excellent art. There are also figures in it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So on that note, we are going to end this conversation, but look forward to futures that science fiction can take us to, and hope that it is ultimately a fiction of hope and not a fiction of despair.
Right.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Manjula. Thank you, Vandana. Thank you very much, Tarun,
Thank
and
you.
thank
Thank you
you,
so
Jaipur
much.
Fest, for having.
Thank you, JLF, for making this possible.
Thanks to everyone. Yes.
Thank you, Tarun K Saint, Vandana Singh, Manjula Padmanabhan, and Arunava Sinha for widening our horizon with this perceptive session. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Please do stay logged on and stay with us throughout the festival to watch all the exciting sessions that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all our 3 venues, so please do stay in touch.